January 16th, 1991, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most devastating air campaigns in modern military history. As coalition forces unleashed Operation Desert Storm against Iraq, the skies above Baghdad erupted in a symphony of destruction that would forever alter the course of Middle Eastern geopolitics. What nobody anticipated in those early hours of bombardment was that Saddam Hussein's prized Iraqi Air Force would soon make a decision so bewildering that military analysts worldwide would debate its logic for decades to come. Air Marshal Hamid Raja al-Takriti stood in the underground command bunker beneath Baghdad. Watching radar screens flicker with hundreds of incoming aircraft, the coalition had assembled the most formidable aerial armada since World War II, with over 2,700 aircraft from 34 nations. American F-15 Eagles, British Tornadoes, and Saudi F-5s streaked across Iraqi airspace with impunity, their precision-guided munitions dismantling the country's air defense network within hours. According to detailed accounts published in the New York Times military archives and subsequent Pentagon reports, the Iraqi Air Force possessed approximately 700 combat aircraft at the war's outbreak, including Soviet-made MiG-29s, French Mirage F-1s, and various other fighters that had made Iraq one of the region's dominant air powers throughout the 1980s. The first 48 hours revealed a horrifying truth to Iraqi commanders. Their pilots were being slaughtered. Coalition fighters equipped with advanced radar systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and beyond visual range missiles were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. For every coalition aircraft damaged, 20 or more Iraqi planes were being obliterated from the sky. The technological gap wasn't merely significant. It was catastrophic. Colonel Assam Owahadathi, a veteran pilot who had flown combat missions during the Iran-Iraq War, received orders on January 19th to lead a squadron of 8 MiG-23s on a reconnaissance mission near Busra. What happened during that mission would haunt him forever. Within minutes of takeoff, American F-15s detected his formation. 3 of his pilots never heard the warning calls. Their aircraft simply exploded around them, torn apart by AIM-7 Sparrow missiles fired from ranges the Iraqis couldn't even detect. Al-Hadathi managed to evade by flying dangerously low over the Shat al-Arab waterway, his hands trembling as he guided his aircraft back to base. That evening, whispers began circulating through Iraqi air bases from Al-Taqadam to Talil. Pilots spoke in hushed tones about impossible odds, about fighting ghosts in the sky they couldn't see until missiles were already streaking toward them. Morale, which had sustained Iraq through 8 brutal years of war with Iran, began crumbling like sand castles before an advancing tide. Then, on January 26th, something extraordinary occurred. A single MiG-25 appeared on Iranian radar screens, approaching the border at high speed. Iranian air defense commanders, still deeply suspicious of their former enemy, prepared to engage. But instead of attacking, the Iraqi pilot transmitted an emergency message requesting asylum. Within hours, he landed safely at an Iranian airbase. Nobody realized it yet, but this lone pilot had just opened a door that would soon become a flood. The question that would perplex strategists for years was already forming. Why would Iraq send its most valuable military assets to the very nation it had fought so viciously just 3 years earlier? January 27, 1991. Dawned over Tehran with confusion rippling through Iran's Revolutionary Guard command structure. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei convened an emergency meeting with military commanders and government officials to address an unprecedented situation. The pilot who had arrived the previous day was being interrogated. His story revealed desperation on a scale few had imagined. Captain Yasser al-Rawi, the defecting pilot, explained through exhausted tears that his entire squadron had been decimated over Kuwait. Of 12 pilots who had taken off that morning, only he survived. The Americans, he insisted, possessed technology that made resistance futile. But more importantly, he revealed something that Iranian intelligence found deeply intriguing. More pilots were planning to follow him. Iran's relationship with Iraq remained poisoned by the brutal Atir War that had ended in August 1988. That conflict, which claimed over 500,000 lives combined, left wounds that still festered throughout both nations. Iranian cities like Khorramshahr and Abadan bore scars from Iraqi chemical weapons and artillery bombardments. The memory of Iraqi Su-22s bombing Tehran's neighborhoods remained vivid in every Iranian citizen's mind. Yet geopolitics creates strange partnerships. President Hashemi Rafsanjani, pragmatic by nature, recognized an opportunity. Iran had been internationally isolated since the 1979 revolution, suffering under American sanctions and regional suspicion. United States military presence in the Gulf, ostensibly aimed at Iraq, made Tehran nervous about becoming Washington's next target. As detailed in diplomatic cables later declassified by the State Department, Iranian officials calculated that accepting Iraqi aircraft might serve multiple strategic purposes. On January 28th, the trickle became a stream. 6 Iraqi Mirage F-1s crossed into Iranian airspace, landing at Mehrabad Air Base near Tehran. By January 30th, the number had grown to 19 aircraft. Iranian air defense commanders stopped scrambling interceptors and instead began directing the incoming Iraqi planes to designated airfields. Back in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein faced an impossible situation. His air force, the pride of Iraq's military might, was evaporating. The Ba'athist regime had invested billions of dollars into building one of the world's largest air forces throughout the 1970s and 80s. These weren't merely military assets. They represented national prestige, technological achievement, and the regime's ability to project power. General Musahim Saab Hassan, commander of the Iraqi Air Force, sat in crisis meetings where options dwindled by the hour. Some commanders advocated dispersing aircraft to neighboring Jordan or Sudan. Others suggested hiding planes in residential neighborhoods, using human shields to prevent coalition strikes. The most hawkish voices demanded suicidal attacks against coalition air bases in Saudi Arabia, accepting total loss, but inflicting maximum damage. But there was another faction, one that whispered about a different strategy. If the aircraft couldn't fight effectively and couldn't remain in Iraq safely, perhaps they could be preserved for future use. Iran, despite the bitter history, represented the only neighboring country with sufficient infrastructure, technical capability, and most crucially, immunity from coalition attacks. Iranian airspace was absolutely off limits to American forces. Its violating it risked expanding the war catastrophically. On February 1st, the exodus accelerated dramatically. Entire squadrons began departing Iraqi bases, some with barely enough fuel to reach Iranian territory. Su-22s, Su-24s, MiG-23s, MiG-29s, and even transport aircraft formed an aerial bridge toward the east. Coalition reconnaissance satellites captured the bizarre spectacle. Iraq's air force fleeing not north to Turkey or west to Syria, but east toward their most hated enemy. Squadron leader Tariq Dalami led a formation of 4 Su-22s toward the Iranian border on February 2nd. His orders came directly from Republican Guard commanders: preserve the aircraft at all costs. As they crossed into Iranian airspace, he radioed back one final message: "We are not defecting. We are surviving. Tell our families we remain loyal to Iraq." But were they? As coalition intelligence analysts tracked the growing fleet of Iraqi aircraft gathering in Iran, a darker question emerged. Was this a strategic preservation effort, or was Saddam about to launch something unexpected? February 5th, 1991, found American intelligence analysts at Central Command Headquarters in Riyadh, staring at satellite imagery that defied conventional military logic. Over 90 Iraqi combat aircraft now sat at various Iranian air bases, and the number continued growing daily. General Norman Schwarzkopf, commanding coalition forces, convened urgent briefings with intelligence chiefs to decipher this strategic puzzle. The initial assessment suggested mass defection demoralized Iraqi pilots abandoning Saddam's regime. But patterns in the aircraft movement suggested otherwise. Entire squadrons arrived together in tight formation, not scattered individuals fleeing chaos. Maintenance crews accompanied some flights. Tellingly, many pilots appeared to remain with their aircraft at Iranian facilities, rather than seeking asylum in Tehran or disappearing into Iran's population. CIA analysts, working with signals intelligence from the National Security Agency, intercepted communications that painted a more complex picture. As documented in later congressional testimony and military journals, Iraqi Air Force Command maintained contact with pilots in Iran through indirect channels. The aircraft weren't being abandoned, they were being stored. This realization triggered fierce debates within coalition command structures. Should American forces violate Iranian airspace to destroy the Iraqi aircraft before they could potentially return to combat? The legal and strategic implications were staggering. Iran maintained official neutrality in the Gulf War, and any attack on Iranian territory would shatter the carefully constructed international coalition that gave Operation Desert Storm its legitimacy. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the accumulation of sophisticated military hardware presented Iranian officials with an unexpected windfall. Defense Minister Ali Akbar Veliati toured airbases where French-made Mirages sat alongside Soviet fighters, all bearing Iraqi Air Force markings. Iran's own Air Force, decimated during the revolution when American maintenance support vanished and further depleted during the Iraq War, desperately needed modernization. These aircraft represent approximately $3 billion in military assets, Veliati reportedly told Rafsanjani during a private meeting recorded in memoirs published years later. Iraq will want them returned eventually. Until then, we have leverage. The Iranian strategy crystallized around calculated ambiguity. Tehran made no official statements about the status of the Iraqi aircraft. They weren't seized as war reparations, nor were they being returned. They simply existed in a legal and political limbo, giving Iran maximum flexibility while watching how the Gulf War concluded. Back in Iraqi air bases, the remaining pilots who hadn't fled faced an increasingly desperate situation. Coalition air superiority was so absolute that Iraqi aircraft barely attempted combat missions after early February. Hardened aircraft shelters, designed to protect planes from bombing, became tombs when precision-guided munitions sealed their entrances with concrete-penetrating warheads. Lieutenant Khalida Lobaidi, a young MiG pilot stationed at Al Asad Air Base, received orders on February 10th that seemed suicidal. Fly his aircraft to Iran immediately. With coalition AWAS aircraft monitoring every movement in Iraqi airspace, even attempting takeoff was extremely dangerous. He delayed, hoping the orders would be rescinded. They weren't. On February 12th, Al-Abidi and 3 other pilots attempted to depart Al Asad under cover of darkness. American F-16s detected the takeoffs within seconds. 2 of Al-Abidi's squadron mates died before clearing Iraqi airspace. Their MiGs erupted into fireballs by AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. Al-Abidi and 1 other pilot survived only by executing violent evasive maneuvers at altitudes so low they scraped sand dunes, eventually crossing into Iran with warning lights illuminating their damaged aircraft. As he landed at an Iranian military field south of Kermanshah, Al-Abidi realized the bitter irony of his situation. 5 years earlier, he had bombed Iranian positions during the Iranian-Iraq War. Now he was dependent on Iranian mercy for survival. The faces of Iranian ground crews who approached his aircraft showed no warmth, only calculation. They knew these planes represented bargaining chips in games far beyond individual pilots' control. By February 15th, the exodus had slowed to a trickle, approximately 115 to 140. Iraqi aircraft estimates varied depending on intelligence sources now resided in Iran. The Iraqi Air Force, once numbering 700 combat aircraft, had been effectively removed from the war without Iran firing a single shot. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush received daily briefings on the situation. Secretary of State James Baker argued for diplomatic pressure on Iran to either destroy the aircraft or hand them over to coalition forces. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney countered that the aircraft no longer mattered strategically. The ground war would soon decide Iraq's fate. What none of them fully appreciated was how this bizarre episode would shape regional politics for years to come. The aircraft sitting in Iranian hangars represented something more profound than military hardware. They symbolized the complete collapse of Iraq's defensive capabilities and the complex web of enmity, opportunity, and survival that defined Middle Eastern geopolitics. As coalition ground forces prepared for the liberation of Kuwait, the mystery deepened. Would these aircraft ever return to Iraq? Would Iran keep them as de facto war reparations? Or was there another possibility nobody had yet considered? February 24, 1991, erupted with the thunder of coalition ground forces crossing into Kuwait and southern Iraq. Operation Desert Saber, the ground offensive, began with overwhelming force that would liberate Kuwait in merely 100 hours. As coalition tanks rolled across the desert, the Iraqi aircraft in Iran sat idle, their absence from the battlefield making Saddam Hussein's defeat inevitable. Inside Iran, the pilots existed in a strange purgatory. They weren't prisoners, but they weren't free. They couldn't return to Iraq without aircraft, and the aircraft remained firmly under Iranian control. Squadron leader Mizena Okafaji, who had led 5 Mirage F-1s to Iran on February 3rd, kept a diary during his time at Isfahan Air Base that later provided historians with intimate details of this period. "We believed we were saving Iraq's Air Force for a future battle," Al-Kafaji wrote on February 26th. "Now we watch television footage of our army being destroyed, knowing we could make no difference even if we returned. The Iranians treat us with cold courtesy. They feed us, house us separately from their personnel, and ask endless questions about our aircraft's capabilities. We are guests who know we may never leave." Iranian interrogation teams operating under Revolutionary Guard intelligence methodically debriefed every Iraqi pilot and technician. They wanted technical specifications, weapons capabilities, maintenance protocols, and tactical doctrines. For Iran, this represented an invaluable intelligence windfall. Much of the Iraqi equipment had been purchased from France, the Soviet Union, and other nations that hadn't sold to Iran since the revolution. Now they had direct access to both hardware and the trained personnel who operated it. The treatment of Iraqi personnel varied dramatically depending on their perceived value. Pilots of advanced aircraft like the Mirage F-1 or Su-104 received better accommodation and subtle inducements to cooperate. Some were offered potential positions as instructors for the Iranian Air Force if they chose to defect permanently. Lower-ranking maintenance crew and transport aircraft pilots received basic accommodation and intensive questioning, but fewer privileges. According to documentation that emerged from Iranian military archives decades later, Supreme Leader Khomeini personally approved a strategy of strategic ambiguity regarding the aircraft. Iran would neither confirm nor deny Iraq's eventual claims to the planes. This position maximized Iran's leverage while avoiding international legal complications. Back in Baghdad, as Saddam Hussein's regime teetered on the edge of catastrophic military defeat, rage over the aircraft festered. Who had authorized this mass evacuation? Republican Guard commanders pointed fingers at Air Force leadership. Air Force generals claimed they followed orders from presidential security services. The truth, tangled in Iraq's labyrinthine command structure where Saddam trusted no single entity completely, became impossible to determine. What emerged from post-war investigations, including testimonies gathered by United Nations inspectors and intelligence services, suggested the evacuation represented multiple overlapping motivations rather than a single coherent strategy. Some aircraft fled because pilots feared for their lives. Others followed orders from commanders trying to preserve military assets. Still others represented genuine defections by individuals who saw Saddam's regime as doomed. The most sophisticated theory advanced by military historians, including Anthony Cordesman in his comprehensive analysis of the Gulf War, suggested Saddam himself may have authorized at least some aircraft movements to Iran as a desperate gambit. If the planes remained in Iraq, they would certainly be destroyed. In Iran, they might survive. Perhaps after the war, through negotiation or even military action, they could be recovered. It was a desperate plan born of desperate circumstances, but it at least offered theoretical preservation of assets. On March 3, 1991, Iraq signed a ceasefire agreement at Safwan airfield. The war was over. Kuwait was liberated. The Iraqi military lay in ruins, and in Iran, over 100 of Iraq's most sophisticated aircraft sat in hangars, their future utterly uncertain. Within days, Iraqi diplomats began making discreet inquiries through third countries about returning the aircraft. Iran's response was coolly noncommittal. "We are evaluating the situation," became Tehran's standard diplomatic formulation, a phrase that would be repeated for years. The pilot's situation grew more complicated. Some requested repatriation to Iraq, gambling that their service record might protect them from Saddam's anger. Others, recognizing the regime would need scapegoats for the humiliating defeat, sought political asylum in Iran or third countries. The Iranian government, calculating maximum advantage, allowed some to leave for countries like Sweden and Canada, while retaining others whose expertise they valued. Major Saad al-Jabouri, a MiG-29 pilot who had flown to Iran on February 8th, faced an agonizing choice in mid-March. His wife and 2 young children remained in Baghdad. Iranian intelligence officers made clear, if he wanted to return, he could do so, but without his aircraft. If he stayed and cooperated with Iranian technical assessments, his family might eventually be permitted to join him. "I chose my family," al-Jibori wrote years later in a published memoir. "I returned to Baghdad in April 1991, expecting imprisonment or worse. Instead, I was debriefed by security services, stripped of rank, and assigned to air defense coordination, a meaningless position. The real punishment was watching Iraq's humiliation, knowing our Air Force had fled rather than fought to the death. We were blamed for losing a war that was already lost before we departed. The question that haunted everyone involved, Iranian, American, and others, was deceptively simple. What would become of these aircraft? They represented billions in military assets, technological secrets, and most importantly, national pride. The answer would take years to fully emerge and would satisfy absolutely nobody. April 1991 found Iraq in chaos as Shia uprisings in the south and Kurdish rebellions in the north threatened to fracture the country entirely. Saddam Hussein, though still clinging to power in Baghdad, faced domestic insurgencies far more dangerous than coalition forces had been. The absent air force that might have helped suppress these rebellions sat uselessly in Iran, and that absence would have consequences nobody had anticipated. Iran watched Iraq's internal turmoil with satisfaction mixed with caution. Revolutionary Guard commanders debated whether to support the Shia uprisings with military aid, potentially turning southern Iraq into an Iranian client territory. The Iraqi aircraft in their possession became bargaining chips in complicated internal Iranian debates about post-war regional strategy. Defense Minister Velati advocated for keeping the aircraft permanently. Iraq owes us over $100 billion in war reparations from the 1980s war, he argued in government meetings later documented in Iranian political memoirs. These aircraft represent partial payment, perhaps 5% of what they owe. We should incorporate them into our Air Force immediately. But President Rafsanjani, focused on rebuilding Iran's economy and reducing international isolation, saw different opportunities. Western nations, particularly European powers, wanted reassurance that Iran wouldn't destabilize the region further. Appearing cooperative on the aircraft issue might ease sanctions and improve trade relationships. Yet actually returning the planes to Saddam seemed both morally wrong and strategically foolish. The solution Iran adopted was bureaucratic genius. Do nothing while appearing to do something. Iranian officials established committees to evaluate the legal status of the aircraft. These committees met periodically, issued reports nobody outside government saw, and reached no conclusions. Meanwhile, Iranian technicians studied every aircraft thoroughly, reverse engineering technologies, and incorporating insights into their own aviation programs. For Iraqi pilots who had returned home, life became increasingly difficult. The regime needed scapegoats, and Air Force personnel made convenient targets. Purges eliminated officers suspected of insufficient loyalty. Others faced show trials for abandoning their posts during wartime. The fact that many had followed direct orders mattered little in Saddam's Iraq, where loyalty meant accepting blame when necessary. Colonel al-Hadithi, who had survived that devastating mission in January, found himself interrogated repeatedly by Mukhabarat intelligence services throughout 1991 and 1992. They wanted to know if the pilots had conspired together to flee to Iran, he later told researchers. They couldn't accept that chaos and survival instinct explained most of what happened. They needed conspiracy, betrayal, and plotters to arrest and execute. By 1993, Iraq's formal attempts to recover the aircraft had become increasingly desperate. Diplomatic notes sent to Iran through the United Nations went unanswered. Economic pressure proved impossible since both nations faced international sanctions. Military recovery was obviously impossible, given Iraq's devastated armed forces. Iran's position hardened into permanence. In December 1994, an Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson made a rare public comment about the aircraft. Equipment that entered Iranian territory during wartime operations may be considered abandoned property under international law. Iraq has provided no documentation establishing ownership or proper authorization for these aircraft to enter our airspace. This legal sophistry outraged Iraqi officials but effectively closed the matter. The aircraft, Iran argued, might have been stolen by defecting pilots. Without Iraqi cooperation in determining their status cooperation, Iraq couldn't provide without admitting its Air Force had abandoned equipment during war. Iran claimed no obligation to return anything. The Iraqi pilots still in Iran faced varying fates. Some successfully emigrated to Western countries using their technical expertise to gain asylum. Others gradually integrated into Iranian society, particularly those who married Iranian women or converted to Shia Islam. A handful eventually worked with Iranian aviation programs, though always under security service supervision and always aware their cooperation came with moral costs. Major Al-Jibori, who had returned to Baghdad, watched the situation with bitter clarity. "We pilots are blamed for losing our aircraft to Iran," he reflected in his memoir's final chapter. But this is false. The Iraqi Air Force was defeated before we ever took off for Iran. Coalition technology and skill overwhelmed us completely. Flying to Iran didn't lose the war. Continuing to fly against the Americans would have just killed more pilots for no purpose. Yet history will remember us as cowards who fled to our greatest enemy. The ultimate fate of the aircraft themselves varied. Iran successfully integrated perhaps 20 to 30 planes into its air force after extensive maintenance and modification. These included some Mirage F-1s and Su-22s that Iranian technicians could maintain with available parts. Others sat in storage, gradually deteriorating as parts were cannibalized for active Iranian aircraft. By 2000, when investigators from Jane's Defense Weekly attempted to account for all the aircraft that had fled to Iran, they concluded that approximately 15 to 20 remained potentially operational. Another 30 existed in various states of storage or disrepair, and the rest had been scrapped or used for technical training.
Mala na 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 na. I'm so unlearned. I'm right all wait. I'm so one right. I'm so right. I'm so right. I'm so right that I will be on all I will right. I'm some reverie am I right and I just shine
The geopolitical impact proved more lasting than the military hardware. The aircraft episode demonstrated several truths that would shape Middle Eastern politics for decades. First, it showed how completely Iraq's military capabilities had been destroyed in 1991, making the country vulnerable to the American invasion of 2003. Second, it revealed Iran's capacity for strategic patience and ambiguity in dealing with adversaries. Third, it illustrated how personal survival instincts could overcome national loyalty in extreme circumstances. For American strategists, the episode raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of air power and the complexities of regional politics. Coalition forces had achieved complete air superiority, yet hadn't prevented Iraq from moving significant military assets beyond reach. The aircraft in Iran represented a loose end that defensive planners disliked but couldn't resolve without potentially catastrophic regional escalation. December 2003 brought new chaos to Iraq as American forces, having invaded in March of that year, struggled to control an increasingly violent insurgency. Saddam Hussein was captured near Tikrit, his regime finally ended. Yet even then, in American intelligence briefings about Iraq's former military capabilities, the aircraft that had fled to Iran 12 years earlier appeared as footnotes in capability assessments, ghosts of a military force that no longer existed. Iranian officials, when asked by journalists about the old Iraqi aircraft during this period, simply smiled and changed subjects. Some planes had been visible in satellite imagery at Iranian air bases throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, but tracking their ultimate disposition became impossible. Iran's aviation infrastructure remained opaque to outside observers, and the Iraqi planes simply faded into that opacity. For the pilots themselves, scattered across continents, the experience became a defining trauma. Those who had stayed in Iraq through Saddam's final years lived under constant suspicion. Those who had remained in Iran occupied a permanent outsider status. Those who had emigrated to Europe, North America, or elsewhere carried memories they rarely shared with anyone who hadn't experienced the Gulf War's peculiar horror. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker interviewed several former Iraqi pilots in Sweden who had participated in the flight to Iran. One, speaking anonymously with his face obscured, offered this reflection: "People ask if we were cowards. They don't understand what it meant to fly against American F-15s with their AYCS support. Their missiles that could kill you from 50 kilometers away. Their electronic warfare that made our radars useless. It wasn't cowardice to fly to Iran. It was choosing to die later rather than immediately. Some choices are between bad and worse, not between good and bad." Academic historians began seriously analyzing the aircraft evacuation only in the 2010s. When enough time had passed and enough documentation had emerged to support scholarly assessment, the consensus that developed recognized the complexity of motivations and the absence of any single explanation. The flight to Iran, as it became known in military literature, represented a case study in how military organizations collapse under overwhelming pressure. Iranian authorities, by 2015, had mostly scrapped or integrated the remaining Iraqi aircraft. Occasional reports suggested one or two ancient Mirages might still exist in storage at remote air bases, kept perhaps as historical curiosities or training aids. But the military significance had vanished decades earlier. The political and psychological significance, however, endured. In Iraq's post-Saddam military reconstruction, the story of the aircraft became a cautionary tale taught in new military academies. Young Iraqi officers, studying Air Force history, learned about the technological gap that had made resistance impossible, the command confusion that had sent planes fleeing eastward, and the geopolitical calculations that prevented their return. The lesson was clear: never allow such military inferiority. Never rely on single-point leadership that creates confusion, and never assume yesterday's enemy can't become today's opportunistic neutral party. Iran used the episode differently in its own military education. Iranian Air Force instructors taught the incident as an example of strategic opportunism and the value of maintaining ambiguous positions that maximized leverage. The windfall of free military hardware, even if much of it proved difficult to maintain, demonstrated how regional conflicts could generate unexpected advantages for prepared neutral parties. For American military planners, the episode influenced thinking about future conflicts in subtle ways. The realization that even totally defeated opponents might preserve assets through creative means-shaped contingency planning. Future air campaigns included more emphasis on tracking potentially relocating aircraft and establishing clearer diplomatic frameworks with neighboring countries about handling such situations. The broader historical significance of the Iraqi Air Force's flight to Iran lies in what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare in the late 20th century. The Gulf War marked a technological turning point where certain types of conventional military resistance became essentially impossible. Iraqi pilots weren't necessarily inferior in skill or courage to their coalition counterparts. They were simply operating with technology from a previous generation against forces from the next generation. In such mismatched circumstances, institutional collapse becomes inevitable. The human cost of this collapse tends to be forgotten in strategic analysis. Hundreds of pilots and crew members saw their professional identities destroyed. Families were separated. Careers ended abruptly. Some pilots who had flown to Iran never saw their families again. Others returned to Iraq to face years of suspicion and reduced circumstances. The aircraft themselves were merely machines. The real story was always about the humans operating them and the impossible positions war placed them in. By 2020, the incident had largely faded from public consciousness, except among military historians and Middle Eastern politics specialists. The aircraft were gone, scrapped for parts or so obsolete as to be militarily irrelevant. The pilots were elderly or deceased. The geopolitical landscape had transformed multiple times. Iraq and Iran, while not friendly, had developed complex economic relationships that made their 1980s war seem like ancient history. Yet the question that began this story, why did the Iraqi Air Force run to Iran, serves a final, complete answer. They ran because the alternative was certain death in unequal combat. They ran because military organization collapsed under technological and psychological pressure. They ran because orders were confused and chains of command fractured. They ran because survival instinct overwhelmed national loyalty. They ran because Iran represented the only sanctuary that coalition forces couldn't touch. They ran because in that moment, running seemed like preserving something that might be rebuilt later, though it never would be. Most fundamentally, they ran because war creates impossible situations where all choices are terrible. And humans confronted with terrible choices often simply try to survive. The strategic, political, and military explanations all matter. But at the core, the Iraqi Air Force's flight to Iran was a story of people trying not to die, of institutions collapsing under impossible stress, and of how the calculations of survival sometimes lead to decisions that seem inexplicable to those not trapped in the same desperate moment. The aircraft never returned to Iraq. Most were eventually destroyed or incorporated into Iran's forces. But the memory of their departure, and what it revealed about war's capacity to shatter not just armies, but the logic that armies depend on, remains relevant to anyone studying conflict, survival, and the space between cowardice and pragmatism that humans occupy when death becomes the only certain alternative.